Hi, I'm Carter Wilson, best-selling author and writing coach, and welcome to Motivations for Writers. So today I want to talk about a misconception that I see all the time in early thriller writing, and I was certainly guilty of this as well, even with some of my published novels. There's this belief that a thriller has to be relentless, that it needs constant action, constant twists, constant visible danger. That if there's a stretch of quiet, something's wrong. And writers often assume that the thriller genre demands noise. But noise is not tension, and that's really the first distinction that matters. Stimulus is what happens, and tension is what it means. Stimulus is external, it's observable, it's kinetic. But tension is psychological. It's interpretive, it lives in perception, not spectacle. What this means is you can pack a manuscript full of events and honestly still generate very little real tension. In fact, the more frequently you deploy visible action without the necessary psychological groundwork, the more you end up just desensitizing the reader. Escalation without emotional instability just becomes spectacle. And we all know that spectacle has diminishing returns. The human nervous system adapts quickly. If every chapter contains a shock, the shocks stop registering. They just become baseline. I think of some of the old James Bond films. James Bond would be running and everybody would be shooting at him and he would never get hit. And after a while, there was just no tension because you just knew he was going to be fine. What doesn't habituate as easily is uncertainty, especially interpersonal uncertainty. Because the most durable suspense does not come from the question, what will happen next? It comes from the question, what's actually true here? And that question doesn't require a dead body on the floor. It requires subtext. So I think early in a writer's development, a thriller writer's development, there's often an overcorrection toward visible drama. A belief that the thriller must constantly perform its identity. That the danger has to be announced repeatedly and emphatically. But announcing danger is not the same thing as creating it. Mastery in this genre, I think, comes from modulation and from restraint and from the deliberate cultivation of unease. If you look at the psychological thrillers that endure, almost none of them are built on continuous physical action. They're built on destabilized relationships, on fractured perception, on withheld information, and on misaligned dialogue. Tone carries the threat long before the plot delivers it. And this is something I've experienced personally. I've had readers come up to me and say, your books are so violent, or they're so dark. And I always find that interesting because if you actually count the pages in my books devoted to physical violence, it's almost far less than what most people remember. What they're reacting to isn't constant brutality, it's the sustained threat. It's the atmosphere, the tone, the sense that something terrible could happen at any moment. I'm far more interested in the buildup than the act itself. If violence appears in one of my books, I want it to feel jarring, inevitable. I want it to interrupt something. I want it to feel consequential, not routine. If bodies are constantly falling, violence becomes procedural. It's just part of the wallpaper at that point. It loses moral weight. But if you hold readers in a state of unease just long enough, if you let the tension accumulate through instability and fractured relationships and subtle shifts in power, then when something finally does happen, it lands. It doesn't just surprise, it disturbs. It alters the emotional landscape of the story. And that really only works if you've exercised restraint up to that point. If you've trusted tone, if you've allowed silence to do some of the work. And silence, honestly, is often underutilized in thrillers. Writers fear that quiet equals boring. But how can you make quiet become oppressive? How can you make a pause become destabilizing? A withheld answer can be more threatening than a confession. Think about a dinner scene between two people who share a secret neither is acknowledging. There's no raised voices, no overt hostility, no physical threat. And yet the room feels suffocating. That's because tension lives in what's being avoided. In that slight delay before a response. In that incongruity between words and body language. In the decision to redirect rather than confront. These are all small behavioral cues, but they accumulate. They create narrative gravity. There's also a structural dimension to this. When writers lean heavily on overt twists, the narrative can become engineered around surprise rather than destabilization. The focus shifts towards outmaneuvering the reader instead of unsettling them. But surprise and destabilization are not the same. A twist is just an event. Destabilization is a condition. A twist happens once, but destabilization lingers. If your storytelling strategy depends primarily on reversals, you will need increasingly elaborate reversals to maintain intensity. And that path often trends towards convolution. You're confusing the reader. They're trying to catch up with you. And that pulls them out of your story. But if your strategy is to cultivate unease through tone and interpersonal ambiguity, escalation can remain psychologically grounded. The stakes can therefore intensify without the plot becoming implausible. And this is where many manuscripts flatten, not because they lack events, but because the events aren't embedded in unstable emotional terrain. A car chase is kinetic. But if we're not aware of what the protagonist stands to lose internally, it's just choreography. A confrontation being loud. If we haven't observed the erosion of trust leading up to that confrontation, it just lacks weight. Threat should be pervasive before it becomes explicit. The reader should feel that something is off long before they can articulate why. And that feeling is achieved through tonal consistency, through disciplined restraint, through allowing moments of silence to stretch just slightly longer than comfortable. When everything in a manuscript is loud, the reader's interpretive faculties disengage. They react, but they don't participate. But when tension is embedded in tone, the reader becomes active. They scan for inconsistencies, for micro shifts in language, for relation imbalance. That participation generates immersion, and immersion generates staying power. So if you feel tempted to increase the body count in order to increase intensity, pause. Ask a different question. Is the emotional architecture unstable enough? Is there enough ambiguity in the relationships? Is there misalignment between what characters say and what they mean? Is there enough unresolved discomfort in the room? Because if the answer is yes, you do not need more noise. You need to hold the tone steady. Let the unease hum beneath the surface. And when the action finally arrives, it'll feel earned. It'll carry weight precisely because it hasn't been overused. Just know that a thriller does not need to scream to be dangerous. It needs to sustain pressure. And that pressure, when managed carefully, is far more powerful than spectacle. That's the difference between a manuscript that's just busy and one that's immersive. Not how many twists it contains, but how long you can keep the reader unsettled without flinching. That's control. And control of tone is what ultimately separates emerging writers from seasoned ones. Not louder, deeper.